When writing emails, blog posts, and creating podcast episodes, novelists often struggle with what to say. Unpublished novelists particularly feel like they have nothing to talk about in their email newsletters. They ask, what can I put in my emails that's not just a sales pitch for a book that's not even for sale? Or they ask, what can I talk about on my blog that's not just me promoting my novels? Won't that get boring? And the answer is yes. If that's all your blog is, it will be very boring. And the same is true with your email newsletter and even with your podcast. But there is a surprisingly easy answer to the question, what should I be writing about? In fact, it's all around you. Writing a novel is a bit like woodwork. And while crafting something out of wood, there's often a lot of leftover lumber. It's bits and pieces that were cut off of other bits and pieces. And savvy carpenters know how to put that leftover lumber to use. So, what is the leftover lumber for novelists? It's research. We all do research for our novels, and some of us do quite a bit. So how can you turn your research into compelling emails, blog posts, and even podcast episodes? Well, find out in this episode of Novel Marketing, the longest running book marketing podcast in the world. I'm Thomas Umstead Jr., CEO of Author Media, and this is the show for writers who want to make a living writing books worth talking about. And don't forget to subscribe to this podcast by clicking follow in the podcast app on your phone or clicking subscribe in our new YouTube channel. And while everyone does at least some research for their book, no one does more research than historical fiction authors. They live in research. In fact, I think for some historical fiction authors, they just write the book as an excuse because they're researching their time period anyway, and they feel like they have to write a book about it. So who better to reveal the secrets of repurposing research than historical fiction author? Well, we are lucky to be joined today by an award-winning historical fiction author who's also a literary agent with the Gardner Literary Agency. Christy Cambron, welcome to the Novel Marketing Podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
So how do you approach research with marketing in mind?
Oh, it's my favorite part of the process, and that's because I get to experience research. One of the things that I love to talk to both readers and writers and even friends about is if you are interested in becoming an author, you can't just step out and say, okay, I want to have an experience that I can maybe use later on social media. It all starts with the passion first for subject matter, for whatever you're looking for. So if there is an opportunity and I'm writing a cooking story, then I'm going to go to a cooking class and I'm going to learn from culinary experts. If I'm writing a story about a character who had tuberculosis in historical context, I am going to go to a former TB sanitarium that is reportedly haunted, and I'm going to go on site and learn. Or if I have a beekeeping storyline, I'm going to go to a working honey farm, and I'm going to let the thousands of bees land on me, all in the name of research. And how can you then pull that into what we're talking about today? Emails, blog posts, even videos, social media. All of that has to do with the opportunity to draw someone into your story. It's so much to ask someone to commit anywhere from 8 to 20 hours of their lives reading your book, whether it's in print or it's on audio or ebook. That's a lot to ask someone. So you have to do just more than write a pretty story on the page. You have to be ready to draw that person into the entire experience.
That's right. And a lot of that research, when you're doing it as a novelist, is more to help keep you from making a mistake, right? So it's like, oh, before I put this gun in my story, I want to go fire this gun at a gun range, or I want to know what it's like being surrounded by bees. But you do want to get the accurate information in there and not have inaccurate information that's obvious, where anybody with a gun pushes up their glasses and like, well, actually a 45 caliber pistol would blah, blah, blah. Right. Yeah. And so most of that experience doesn't end up in the book, which gives you an amazing opportunity to tell that story and say, oh, I went to go feed the bees or go collect honey, and here's what it was like. And you tell the story beginning, middle, and end. If you tell the story well, which if you're a novelist, hopefully you've learned how to do, can make a really interesting email, and it allows that whole event to be useful, not just that one thing that you learned that kept you from making a fool of yourself.
Yeah, I think there are really two types of approaches to research. One is that very archival aspect that you just noted. So, for example, if I am writing a World War II novel and it's set during the Blitz in London in September of 1941, I'm going to go to the weather archives for that specific block, that area of London during September 1941, and I'm going to note the exact date, what was the weather, or what were the moon cycle that we were in, all because I want to ensure, as a novelist, it's on me. It's not on my editor to do that hard work and make sure that I have a solid framework of the research. So that's the first part. The second part is what is all encompassing for a reader to experience the story, what we were just talking about. So what would it look like, sound like, smell like, taste like, and feel like for readers to step into that world, almost like a movie experience, if you will. And that's really what you can do with research, is adding to the prose. And so adding into small things just in your dialogue, things in your scene setting. You can add in specific aspects that don't have as much to do with fact, if you will, historical fact, or that archive type perspective, but can make your story really sing. It just takes it, it's just a level up for your story.
And the people who are the biggest fans of your genre, the most influential people in your genre, are the folks most likely to get triggered if you get the details wrong, and are the most likely to be delighted if you get the details right. So it's like, maybe most of your readers wouldn't notice, but the ones who would, they're like, oh, finally, this author really gets this era of history or this profession, right? If your main character is a doctor, you'd better talk to some doctors and go visit some hospitals and visit them as an author, not as a patient, because your mind is not in the game. You're
Right.
not taking good notes.
You don't want to go on that reasoning.
Yeah. What are some other tips for kind of preparing for that research event?
Yeah, I think one of the best things is to make sure that you have a travel partner who is ready and willing to support and go with you 100%. And so my husband and I have 3 sons, and even when they were young, this is for the last 12 years I've been in publishing, this is just part of our family's experience. We go on research trips together, and it was part, okay, who's going to take care of this kid and hold this kid? And, if I'm speaking with a museum curator, I may be holding the camera out and filming while I'm doing that, or I have someone filming me while I'm speaking to the curator, and my husband may be standing there holding the toddler. And then, believe it or not, he is such a fabulous research partner that we would switch. Maybe the toddler wanted me, and I'm still standing there talking to the museum curator, but my husband is going to piggyback on something I said or I asked, and he's going to ask further questions, and it may take us down a lane of research that we hadn't thought about prior. So I think it's really good to have someone who is willing to go with you and support you. And I think you want to have a little bit of the fearless factor. I have a best friend from high school, and we go on local research trips together. I would call her and say, okay, example was the honey farm. She actually went with me to a 4th generation honey farm. And I loved her fierce perspective on it, because she said, okay, so when we get stung, like, what do we do? And she just went into this thinking, we're going to get stung. Like, this is my commitment level. You want people like that. You want fellow researchers like that. So that's always a good thing. Another thing is simply ask. I think a lot of times we can have a little bit of apprehension, like, oh, people are busy, people have a lot going on, they might not be able to assist. One of the novels that I wrote was set in a vineyard. It was the Lost Castle series, book 1. It was set in the western part of France, and I knew nothing about vineyards or champagne, which only comes from Champagne in France. And so I had to go to vineyards in the US. And I think I reached out to 25 vineyards. And there were a few who welcomed me in. And then it happened to be Arrington Vineyards in Tennessee who welcomed me and my agent, Rochelle Gardner. And we went and we toured with the vintner, and we were able to get all of this behind the scenes information. So I think sometimes it's a numbers game. It's just reaching out to as many museums, professionals, as many researchers as you can who are actually out there doing the job, doing the work. And I think you will find they are so passionate. They're ready to tell you everything. Like, sign up, get your cell phone ready to record, because they are going to tell you their life story in this role.
And when you reach out, make sure to mention that you're an author, because the
Absolutely.
experience that you get may be very different. I was reading the acknowledgments of a novel, and a key location was this police department. And the whole time this book was taking place, that police station felt very real. And at the end of the book, I realized why. Because it turned out he had reached out to this police station, this police department, and they'd given him a tour of every room. they drove him around the town. He got to do a ride along with the police officer. He got to be in the vehicles, and they rolled out this red carpet for him. And so when he's talking about the local sheriff trying to deal with the drama, it's like, well, my book is sci-fi. I can't do research for it. Like, this author did, and it really helped, right? It's like, sure, the apocalypse was fantasy or fiction, hopefully, right? Hopefully we don't have nuclear waste falling from the sky.
Right.
Hopefully the robots don't rise up and take us down, or the zombies don't come. But the place is still the same, and the people are still the same, and it gave it this really great sense of reality. And they wouldn't have done that for him if he said, hey, I'm a tourist. Can I see your building? Right? Maybe if you're like, hey, I have a 5-year-old and he wants to be a policeman when he grows up, you get to see the front office. But if you want to go be in the jail and hear what it sounds like when the bars close behind you in an empty jail cell, they might do that for an author. That's one of the perks of being an author. And so why not ask?
Absolutely.
It'll make your story better. And it's one of the funner elements of being an author. And you can remind yourself of that when you're in the middle of edits and you're giving up hope. It's like, hey, there are some perks to this job.
Yeah, especially for historical fiction. My family and I was writing a book about John and Mabel Ringling and the Ringling brothers during the Jazz Age. And so we went to Sarasota, Florida 3 times. Again, it was a situation where you just ask. The worst thing that can happen in that situation is they say no. And actually they said yes 3 times. And they let our entire family go behind the scenes. We were able to open every drawer, every closet, look at every baseboard, every light switch. And of course, I recorded it all, again, not with the motivation of, I could use this later on social media. In many ways, video on social media at the time, about 8 years ago, wasn't as used as it is now. And so we were using it really for me, for my research purposes, because I'm a storyteller. I went to art school. I really see the world through visual imageries. And so making sure with the way that I process information that we had everything recorded, it was really helpful. But the amazing thing, especially if you're writing, as I said, historical fiction, I got all of these real life stories of the people. Like, there were question marks. Did Walt Disney go to some of the flapper parties that were there, right? And so you could really imagine through history, just walking through the footsteps of the characters that I was getting ready to write about. And yeah, the curators they opened every door for us. And we got to hear all the kind of behind the scenes, maybe 1920s gossip a little bit that eventually went into the novel. And so, yeah, just asking those experts, and very often they'll say yes, and they'll invite you in as an author. And you give them credit in the acknowledgments. And that's a big thing, a big thank you.
Yeah. And for people in author world, being mentioned in acknowledgments isn't a big deal, but for normal people, that's a really big deal. They love being mentioned and immortalized in acknowledgments.
Or name a character after.
Yeah, or name a character.
I've done that too.
I occasionally will be reading books and people will name characters after me, not even tell me. I'm like, hey, if you're going to name a character after me, at least you can do is send me a copy of the book.
And hopefully not the villain. Hopefully you're the hero.
One of the risks of working with authors for so many years, you get worked into stories one way or the other. So we talked about taking photos, and you're mentioning video, and I feel like this is one of the big things now where you have an amazing video camera in your pocket, especially for the visual element. The microphone's not super great, but if you're holding it, it's not terrible. And so, like, when you're interviewing, say, a museum curator, are you filming that interview the whole time, or how are you incorporating video into the work? Not just for remembering for research later, but maybe to repurpose for marketing.
I think it's important to repurpose for marketing that you go into any interview with a plan, because there are really 2 approaches you can take. The first one can be, this is research information, this is for me, right? Or this is a first person interview. Perhaps you're writing World War II and maybe you're going to sit down and you're going to interview a Holocaust survivor. That type of filming, you always want to make sure that you are very respectful with the person that you're speaking with, right? Like, so you ask them ahead of time, may I record this? This will not be used externally. This is just for my own research purposes. I have done that in the past. And so that's the first approach. The second approach can actually be something that you need to have a little bit more planning for. And that's if you do plan to use it in content creation, if you do plan to use it on a TikTok or on an Instagram. Again, you want to make sure that you are following all laws. You want to make sure you're following all of that. Know that ahead of time. But I think respect and just knowing what institutions you are in and what institutions allow you to do when you are on premises, that's just a matter of respect as an author. And that will serve you well. well in the future. So those are really the two approaches that you can take either way.
Yeah, definitely get that permission ahead of time. It's not just a matter of following the laws. It's also a matter of good hospitality and good courtesy.
Absolutely.
But sometimes it is a matter of following laws. I was talking with one author, and he was talking about he was getting a tour around a military base, and he was around the back of an airplane, and his guide stopped and looked at him like, "You didn't take a picture, did you?" And he's like, "No." It was like, apparently there was something on the back of this airplane that was classified, and if he had taken a picture, he may have gone to jail for like a very long time as a spy.
I could have said something ahead of time.
Yeah, well, I don't think he realized it, or right, because the planes don't always have sensitive material on them, but apparently this one did at this time. And so it was like, be very careful ahead of time what you take pictures of. Most of the time, if you're at like a museum or some kind of touristy location, they would love to talk a million hours and for you to feature them in, because for them it's free promotion, right? So there's kind of that category where you would ask, of course, and of course they're going to say yes. And then you have things like, the kitchen of a restaurant where maybe they're a little nervous, you taking pictures, but maybe they're cool with it. Or the police department that's like, we're happy for you to take these pictures and keep them personal, but please don't share these, we don't want, the inner workings of our jail published online. Like, I understand that. So get that permission ahead of time, but do think about as you're shooting video, what parts of this could be useful. And then I would say, then don't share that video online. This is
Absolutely.
a really
Say that
common
again.
mistake. You've filmed 5 hours of footage and you love it, right? You are in love with this time period. You're in love with this location. You're in love with your story, and you're going to watch all 5 hours of these many times. Your fans are not that level of fan that you are. And so you want to take out the very best bits, the most interesting bits, and you want to connect them in a narrative of some kind with the beginning, a middle, and an end, and actually make a fun video that's interesting on its own right, not just because it's connected to your book. In fact, I would say it doesn't have to be super connected to your book, just enough to make people curious. Like, why is she visiting a vineyard, right? Why is she going to a Civil War battlefield, right? That question that's unanswered, that curiosity becomes a powerful marketing asset that you can tap into for that person later on when your book does come out.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. And I think just another note about video, if you are interviewing someone, video is so powerful because you can see the emotion on their face. You can see their body language. You can see as they're recounting something or they're sharing a story, you can see those emotions where if you're just taking notes in a notebook, you might get what they said, but you're not able to see how they were feeling about what they said. And that's something that as writers, we always want to transfer that emotional quality into our writing. And so that's another way where recording your interviews and recording your research, it really can be powerful for you later as a writer to make sure that your story is that much more in depth.
That's right. So we talked about photos, we talked about videos, and we mentioned notes. And I want to say note taking is still valuable if you take notes in the right way. So taking notes on the interview, you don't need to do that because you've already recorded the interview. But what your notes can capture that the photos and videos can't is your emotional reaction to the things that you're seeing. How is it making you feel? I remember visiting World War I battlefields with my dad when I was 6 years old. And I didn't know anything about World War I because I was 6 years old. In fact, my first lessons about World War I were at those battlefields. And so for me, it's a trench in the ground. It's like a ditch that's mostly filled in. And I'm looking at my dad and I'm like, Dad, why are you crying? Right? So my perspective was the camera perspective. It's like, it's a ditch. Why are you like, what about, it's like my dad who just not known for crying. I think I've only seen him cry maybe a handful of times in my entire life. One of the times I saw him crying was at a World War I battlefield because the enormity of what that battlefield represented and what that trench represented was really powerful to him. Not capturable super easily on a photo, tricky to capture on camera. Most people's emotions get all cattywampus once you put them on camera. In fact, most of what you see on camera is actually artificial, right? Actors aren't really feeling the way that they think that you're feeling. That's kind of the whole job. Or,
a little bit.
I'm not going to totally break it down. There's different methods, but like if you really want to capture that emotion, there's something to journaling as you go, right? So you have your photos, you have your video, and then you have your own personal journal of like, I was really intimidated to hold that sharp knife after the chef demonstrated just how easy it would be to cut my fingers off right as he was cutting that chicken. I was realizing there's nothing stronger about my fingers than that chicken, and then he handed me the knife. How did that make me feel, right? That kind of visceral emotional response you can only capture in your written notes.
I think another rule of thumb is when you're talking about doing research, doing interviews, and as you mentioned, jotting down how you feel about this. Sometimes I do a vlog just of myself. So I will step away from that interview, and maybe if I am researching at a manor house, I will walk around the house and record what that house looks like. And, okay, this is what the individual was telling me about the garden, and here's the garden that they were showing me, or here's the view across Sarasota Bay. That is very helpful. And very often when I'm scheduling an interview, I will pad the end of the interview with an additional 30 minutes to 1 hour of quiet time for myself so that I can get those thoughts down, any initial ideas that I have. If I'm at the beginning of a brainstorming process, I don't even know what the timeline of the story is. I just know there was this amazing thing that happened in that manor house or on that marble terrace, and I want to capture it. And so very often those notes for me are what become powerful chapters later when I have the story that I'm mapping out.
I think the same is true for preparing marketing assets. So you go to a location or you go to a research event with kind of a general idea or a plan, kind of the same way you would plan out your weekly trip to the grocery store, right? Like, I know I want to prepare this meal, right, and prepare this other meal, but I also know I want to get eggs. I don't have a particular plan for these eggs, but I know I'm going to need eggs. And then once your pantry is full, so to speak, then you can plan out your specific meal. And it may be that something at the store surprises you, or you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize strawberries are in season. I want to buy a whole bunch of strawberries, which wouldn't work at my house because I have small children that can magically make strawberries vanish. Often
they all do that, right?
Before the groceries get unloaded. Yeah. And so the same thing happens with your research, right? You go in with a general plan, and then you get home, and then you have all of these assets, right? You've got these beautiful photos that you took. You have all of this video that you shot. You've got the notes that you've made. So how do you take that pantry's worth of material and start preparing an interesting email from all of that research?
Yeah, I think, again, it's just bringing your readers into the story with you, into the experience, because that's really what they want. I have found so often when I'm in a book signing line and people walk through and they ask me to sign the book, more often than not, they're not interested in the story that either they just read from me or they're getting ready to read. They want to tell me their story, right? They want that connectiveness, that connection. So they want to feel like they have the inside, behind the scenes look at your research or what's behind the story. And that can be a powerful way to draw readers in. So if you're sending out an email newsletter and we're talking about research and marketing information, I repurpose content so often. Why? Because you have new readers who come along who've never seen it before, right? And they don't have a lot of context. Maybe they found your 10th novel and they haven't read the 9 before that, and they don't know the story behind that. So they're looking for a way to feel that they are a part of the story. So one of the things that I tend to repurpose in when I send out email newsletters are some of those better photographs or that are connected to the better stories, if you will. So our family, a few years ago, we had a 9-day research road trip across Ireland, and we did pretty much what you were talking about. Is we had a plan, but it was a loose plan. Like, we knew the inns that we were going to stay at. We knew where we were going to lay our head on the pillow at night. But other than that, and having tickets ahead of time for certain events and, manor houses and things and castles. Other than that, it was open, and it was almost like this is where the research wind is going to take us. And some of those photographs, there was one where we were driving. My husband was super brave, and he was driving on for America, the wrong side of the car and the wrong side of the road. And he had a wife who is a terrible navigator, especially in a foreign country. And so I'm twisting the map and turning the map, and surprise, we got lost. We got lost. So we're on this back road in Ireland, but it was one of the most beautiful moments of our family's life, because then along the coast on the Ring of Kerry, we are lost on this road. It had just rained a little bit. The skies cleared, and here is the most amazing double rainbow. And we got some of the most fantastic stories and photographs and video footage out of that actually was put into some video footage that was used later in a nonfiction project that I worked on. And that was not the motivation. The motivation for us was, oh, wow, what a moment. We wanted to capture it. And then in capturing it, that's something that I have repurposed many times over. That book was set in Ireland. And so every time you have St. Patrick's Day, I pull out those photos and I engage readers through email newsletters. And I find that with emails, if you have a plan that you typically follow, let's say that you are going to engage your readers in, okay, this is my book news, right? Like here's the email at the top. I'm going to have my book news. Here is my research trails. Come along with me. This time we're going to Paris and we're going to go look at some patisserie shops, and you can go along with me as I'm working on my next novel. And then here down at the end, here's some industry news. Here, one of the things I love to do is give seasonal reading lists. These are some of the books that I loved when I was reading and researching for that novel that I wrote. Or here are some friends' books, because we all know that in this industry, uplifting others and sharing other books, that's very often a way that we can encourage reading, and readers will end up finding not just some amazing stories that you've written, but amazing stories that many people have written and should be shared. And so that's something that I typically will put in the emails as well. And I find that if you have a few really solid videos and solid photographs that you can use, anytime you have a backlist book that's on sale, you can pull that photo out and it can be useful to be able to share like a sale or a promotion or something for a holiday, something that is specific to a season. It's really a great way to draw new readers in.
And if you do a really good job with that email, right, you tell this great story about getting lost in Ireland and seeing a double rainbow, and you've got this amazing photo. That's the sort of email that you can also work into a drip sequence or an onboarding sequence as you're introducing yourself to new readers. So it doesn't just have to be a one-off email that you send to all of your current subscribers. You can also be like, hey, here is what this fantasy world looks like, right? The fantasy world is inspired by West Texas. And so here is my adventure in West Texas where we got stranded, 50 miles away from the nearest gas station. And look, you can see the curvature of the earth or whatever, right? It doesn't have to be visits to Europe. I realize that from a tax perspective, a trip to Europe has some advantages. And I will say, real quick on the tax thing, everything that we're talking about, right? This having the plan, taking the photos, taking the videos, taking notes, all of this looks like doing it with a business-like intent. If this were to come up in an audit, this is a very professional way to do it and a much more defensible way to do it than like, oh yeah, I just visited Ireland. I thought it would be influential for my books. That's again, I'm not a CPA. Do take the course with a real CPA for the details.
Correct. But
I can just tell you that kind of happy-go-lucky doesn't look like a business trip. It looks like a vacation. But you going with your family to experience it and taking notes, that looks more like a business trip. So blog posts are very similar to emails. And I would say most of the things that would work in an email also work on a blog post. The biggest difference, I would say, with a blog post is that blog posts allow you to embed video into the blog post without them leading to go somewhere else. So most email apps, most of the time, if you click a video, it'll open up a browser window that will take you to another website, or it'll open up an app, right? It'll trigger the YouTube app, or it'll trigger the Instagram app if they have that up on their phone.
Right.
And so video actually doesn't work well for email as a part of a longer narrative, right? Just like, hey,
right,
here's this 3,000 word story of me climbing the cliffs of Dunnottar Castle to sneak in because the door was closed. Not that I ever did that. Totally did that one time. Almost killed myself.
I feel like you're admitting something big here. Should we scratch this?
It was my last day. It was my last day in Scotland, and the door was locked. I'm like, I'm not going to let this keep me out. So I leveraged my ancient Viking ancestry and I scaled the cliff to get into Dunnottar Castle. And
as we do.
as we do, right? I had no plan
of
getting down the cliff. My life, I think, was saved by some groundskeepers who were in the castle who let me out. The biggest key is like a foot-long key put in this giant metal door. Anyway, story for another time. But what you could do if you were telling that story in a blog post is you could have little clips of video. Like, oh, here's what the giant key looked like. Here is what the cliff looked like, right? And then you could mix that with photos. You could have photos, text, video, kind of walking through. Blogging is a good platform for that, whereas email is a little bit more restrictive. One or two good photos, maybe 3 or 4 tops, but email starts to kind of groan when you put too many photos in it. Mm-hmm. Whereas a blog post, if you want to put 12 or 24 photos, that's fine. It handles a high number of photos much better. Blog, you can kind of see is like the advanced version of email. Maybe you email out the email version and then you link to the blog version that's got a little bit more multimedia. But I guess the big question is, well, what about social media? What about video?
Right.
So most social media sites aren't really social media anymore. They're all becoming TikTok, right? Instagram is TikTok,
Yep.
YouTube is TikTok, Twitter is TikTok, right? So now social media is pretty much all video. If you want to make, again, Novel Marketing Method doesn't call for social media. I don't recommend social media. But if you are going to do social media and you expect to get some results, you need to be willing to get on camera. And so if you're getting on camera and you're shooting some good video, the temptation is, well, why don't I post it to Instagram? So I know you're a believer in social media still. So how do you work the video and other media elements of your research into your social media strategy?
That's a great question, because you said, how do you work that into your social media strategy? You have to have a strategy, and every author is different. So going back to that research trip that we did in Ireland, that was in 2016. We were there for the centennial of the Easter Rising. That's the book that I was writing. And so I had all of this opportunity to spend this time with my family, but it was international rates on my phone. So I realized, oh, wow, I can't be on social media while I'm over here in Europe. It's going to cost too much money. And what hit me when I got home was, wow, I was so present with my family the entire time. And I started to look back. I really kind of had this gut punch, and I started to look back and think, wow, when I'm in the stands watching my son's basketball game, am I taking video and then looking away from him so I can quickly post it to Facebook at the time? Or am I present? Am I engaged? And so at that point, this might surprise you, but in the fall of 2016, I came home and I deleted all social media apps from my phone, and I have not brought them back. And at the time of this recording, this is late summer 2024. And so I find that, again, it's having a strategy. So for me, social media, I love connecting with readers. It's a huge part of what I do as both an author and a literary agent, but I'm strategic about it. So there are specific times in my day on my schedule, and I only access social media for that engagement through my laptop. And that is what has worked for me, both from a mental health perspective, both from a relational perspective, making sure that I am present anytime I'm with family, friends, peers, anything, my clients. I want to be 100% present. And that for me was a way that worked. Now, if we're talking about, okay, social media, there's so many people out there who say, I have the answer, and you do this, and this is what's going to gain big followings, or this is how you're going to go viral in this year, and it changes tomorrow. We all know that the algorithms are leaning very heavily towards video. So we, as you said, we do have to get our faces on camera. So you have to find out what's going to work for you. And the spaces that I like to connect with readers are where my readers are. I write historical fiction, so I find that certain platforms, there are just naturally more of my readership in those spaces. And I focus on the areas that I'm good at, and I focus on the areas that I feel like I do well. As a former art student, I enjoy art, and I enjoy photography, and I enjoy sometimes doing videos, and sometimes I enjoy putting some of my vulnerabilities out there in an Instagram reel. Why? That helps me connect with my readers and connect with people out there. So that would be the biggest encouragement that I have. You don't have to be everywhere all the time, and don't beat your head against the wall trying to make yourself good at something that you just aren't getting very well. So if Instagram reels aren't your thing, then find another thing that is for you, that you can thrive in.
And don't forget, most successful authors, the really, really successful ones, don't do any social media at all. And you're like, but I see them on social media. It's like, no, you see their team on social media. So
Absolutely.
For most novelists particularly, if you take the time that you were doom scrolling and instead you spend that time reading good books and writing good books, working on your craft, you will go so much farther, so much faster. So I don't want to put any pressure on you to do any sort of social media. And everything we've been talking about with the research can work just with photos and text. You don't actually have to do the video bit. It may be nice, and if you're comfortable with video and you know how to edit a video and you know how to take that 5 hours of video and turn it into a cool 2-minute clip, then that could be a real advantage for you. But if you're like, the idea of learning how to edit video, Thomas, just makes me want to quit, then don't do video. You don't have to. Good photos are enough. And you can learn how to take good photos by just watching a few videos on how to get the light behind you and framing. Like, the fundamentals of photo taking aren't that complicated. And your phone now does most of the heavy lifting for you in software. It's so much easier than it was when I was a kid, when I had to get the aperture right and the shutter speed and all the rest of it.
Oh, yes, all the things, absolutely. But I think another thing that I find that works very well for me, especially in email, in my newsletter, is while I'm not embedding video, I am drawing those readers out to social media sites where they can find video. So I'll give them a teaser. Here's a photograph, like we said, of that double rainbow in Ireland. And then they click a link and it draws them over to Instagram where I have a reel and they can read the whole caption. I don't have to double write anything. And actually, it's easier for them because it's a one-click story, right? So my email newsletter is a great way to draw some of those people over to these other social media platforms that they don't follow me on.
And final tips when it comes to doing research for marketing. I have one more for you. We may have more. Christy, I'm sure, has some more. But my one tip would be to work your audience in ahead of time. So you're like, hey, I'm about to meet with an expert in medieval swords tomorrow for my fantasy book. What questions do you have about medieval swords? And you just throw that out to your email list. Well, one, it's kind of a cheat code almost in terms of preparing because your audience is going to give you way better questions than what you would generate because you already know these questions are interesting to your audience because they sent them to you, right? So it gets them excited ahead of time. It gives you a whole free email that's not a lot of work. You'll often get your highest engagement on any email on a short, hey, I'm about to do X. Do you have any questions about X type email? Readers love to get that kind of email. And then when you do send an email out, it's like, hey, I met with a medieval sword expert and you won't believe what I learned. Then you have this big long blog post, you have this big email about it, you have photos of the different kinds of swords. Your audience is now even more primed for that email than they would have been ahead of time. And you'll notice that I occasionally will do this for the podcast where I'll post on authormedia.social, hey, what questions do you have about this certain topic? Or what pains or sorrows do you have around the topic, right? Where sometimes I'm just trying to identify the pain point, right? What's your frustration here? And I find that your feedback really helps make the episode better, helps me ask better questions. And this is a really easy way to increase the quality of your research from a marketing perspective, because what your readers won't help you with is the specific questions about the story they haven't read yet, right? Like, you know that your character is going to be carrying a shield and needs a sword that pairs well with a shield. And you need to actually learn about the kinds of shields that pair well with swords in this era. So yes, I'm talking to a sword expert, but really I have questions about the shields. Your readers don't know about that, but that's not the point, right? You're not asking them to research your book for you. You're asking them to help make this research event more useful from a marketing perspective so that they can enjoy being along with you on the journey as you learn about whatever it is that you're learning for your book. Yes, even your fantasy book has things you need to research. And if you can make learning about science fun for your readers will love you all the more.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not Jane Austen, but science is a close second, right?
The founders of science fiction, one of them is a guy named Asimov, and he was an actual scientist. He was published in actual scientific journals, as well as writing science short stories, as well as writing many of the famous science fiction stories we still make movies of today. And so he saw science fiction as a way of helping teach science, but he was also writing short stories. If he had been a blogger, if that had existed, Asimov's Substack would have had 1 million subscribers. Because a lot of the kinds of content that he created outside of his books were very Substack friendly, very blog friendly, very email friendly. And so what we're talking about here is nothing new. It's easier now than it used to be, right? The fact that you've got a $100,000 camera in your pocket and it didn't cost you $100,000, right? Like Steven Spielberg would have killed for your iPhone back in the 1980s, right? It's so much better than what we had access to back then in so many ways. So it's easier, but you still have to do the work and you still have to approach it intentionally. So, Christy, what other tips do you have for somebody who's just now starting to think about research from a marketing perspective?
I think we can take the conversation that we just had and the things that you just said, and you can even level up on that with the buy-in from your audience. So even ahead of time, say, okay, everyone, I have a full day in New York City. Where should I go? Should I go to the Met? Should I go to Ellis Island? Okay, let's go to Central Park, that type of thing. So getting buy-in. And again, if it's from, let's say, a historical perspective or a research perspective, asking your audience, audience what they want to see very often is a great way to engage them and pull them in. I guarantee you, if you are a Regency author and you are going to the Jane Austen Festival at Bath, everyone's going to have an opinion. They know what they want to see. They want to see someone there with the Mr. Darcy statue that says, please do not kiss. They want to see if you will sneak in a kiss. They want to see that, right? So anything that is historical is fair game. I'm not advocating for doing that, by the way. Follow all rules and regulations. However, it could be useful. So gaining buy-in from your audience is a fantastic way to bring them along the journey of that story that you are either writing or talking about or sharing with them. Again, it's all about drawing them into the story along with you.
Christy, tell us about your most recent book and how you did the research for it. So kind of put it all together for us.
Yeah, so my most recent release is The British Booksellers. That novel has been on my heart for quite a long time. It is a bookshop book, so I will use air quotes, a bookshop book, right? How many of us love books about books or bookshops? And it centers on the Forgotten Blitz. So the areas of the Blitz during 1940 and 1941 that were hit, but hit outside of London. And the Coventry Blitz was November 14th and 15th of 1940, and it was actually the largest civilian single event loss of life for Britain during World War II, and it's not known as much about that. And so I thought, okay, wow, I usually start a story with a fact, such as, okay, what is the Coventry Blitz? And then I will marry that with a question or an idea. I wanted to write a bookshop book. So it's almost like a You've Got Mail type scenario here. What if you have two bookshop owners across the street from each other, warring bookshops, they're trying to get sales, trying to keep customers, and a real war lands on their doorstep? What do you do in that scenario? And so that's what the book really focuses on. The heartbeat of the book is how stories and books and bookshops bring people together, bring communities together in the most uncertain circumstances of the Blitz and not knowing, are we going to survive today? And how do you keep going? That type of courage is just another brand of awesome. And so when you find a story like that, it feels pretty special. Now, how did I marry the research along with that? Because I will just go ahead and admit this now. The research and the history is my favorite part of the writing process. I also write historical romance, and I'll say that again. The history and the research is my favorite part of the process. So I have had my editors say to me on more than one occasion, Christy, you have to add a kiss in here. Like, you have to. This is historical romance. And I was over here focused on the history part. So for me, again, it was incorporating that archival research. Where were the bombs that fell? What was the damage? There were 37,000 homes that were damaged in this event. And so this was a substantial event. And how would we have the reader step into that event and experience that? And so finding ways to incorporate those small facts and figures and those archival aspects. Weather's a great one. Names are another one. If you're not sure where to find those names that are going to work for your story, walk through a cemetery. Go ahead and be like J.K. Rowling and walk through a cemetery in Scotland and find those names that are going to work for your stories. So that has always been helpful. And again, writing this story, I think what you have to have is that North Star, right? For your story, that guiding star. Research can get you there, but you have to have the heartbeat for the story. And for me, that was how books and stories bring communities together.
It's interesting. Your book is about the Coventry Blitz because that same trip as a 6-year-old where we visited the World War I trenches, we also went to Coventry. And I remember seeing there's a cathedral there that they've kept in its ruined state. And I remember that hitting me. It hit me more than the World War trenches I didn't know anything about. If I had to go back to France today, I would have appreciated the trenches. But even 6-year-old me could see that ruined building and understand the devastation of that bombing. So very cool. We will have a link to that book in the show notes if you'd like to check it out. And we'll also have a link to Christy's website if you want to sign up for her email newsletter and see how she works her historical research into her email newsletters. But again, if you want to learn more about World War II, I do recommend that you check out Christy Kemblin's website, which we will link to in the show notes. Christy, thank you so much for joining us today on the Novel Marketing Podcast.
Thank you. It's been a lot of fun.
Our featured patron is Jeremiah Friedley, author of Association, a core series prequel. When 15-year-old Kristen's uncle is accused of attempted murder, she determines to help him clear his name of something she knows he didn't do. But soon she realizes she's not just fighting a false accusation, she's fighting a conspiracy to take down the social activist her uncle supports. With a relentless police inspector watching her every move, Kristen must choose: avoid the authorities and help her uncle, or stay safe and let her family tear apart. Jeremiah, thank you so much for becoming a patron of the podcast. Thank you for your support that helps keep this podcast on the air. I really appreciate it. On the baby front, still no baby. My wife is great with child, as the King James would say, and we are ready to meet this new little one. We don't know if it's a boy or a girl, and we are eagerly waiting. We're hoping August doesn't get too hot here in Texas. The Novel Marketing Podcast is a production of authormedia.com. Our guest today was Christy Cameron. Our producer is Lori Christine. The audio engineering is William Mumstadt. The blogifications by Shauna Lettler. And you can find that blog version of this episode at authormedia.com/428. I'm Thomas Mumstadt Jr. saying thank you for listening and live long and prosper.